A narrow stretch of water, barely 21 miles wide at its tightest point, has once again become the epicenter of a global crisis. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically vital waterways on Earth, is now at the center of a decision that could ripple through every economy, every government, and every household on the planet. In a move that stunned allies and adversaries alike, former President Donald Trump has ordered what officials are calling a full-spectrum maritime enforcement action in and around the Strait of Hormuz. The objective, according to early reports, is to choke off Iranian-linked oil shipments and reassert control over one of the world's most critical energy corridors. But the consequences were immediate. Within hours, oil markets plunged into chaos. Tanker routes were disrupted. Insurance rates for vessels skyrocketed. And global energy traders began sounding alarms that this could trigger one of the most severe supply shocks in modern history. Because nearly 20% of the world's oil passes through this single choke point. Now imagine that flow. Interrupted. Iran has already issued a warning, calling the move an act of economic warfare. Military officials in Tehran are reportedly on high alert. U.S. naval assets in the region have been repositioned, and intelligence sources suggest that multiple countries are now scrambling to secure alternative energy routes, if they even exist. This is no longer a regional standoff. This is a global flashpoint. What makes this moment especially dangerous is not just the scale of the decision, but the speed. There was no gradual buildup, no extended diplomatic signaling. Instead, a sudden decisive action that has forced every major power to respond in real time. The question now is no longer whether this will escalate. The question is, how far? Will Iran retaliate directly? Will other nations defy the blockade? And could this trigger a chain reaction that pulls global powers into a wider conflict? Because history has shown us something very clearly. Conflicts that begin in the Strait of Hormuz rarely stay contained. They expand, they intensify, and sometimes they spiral out of control. In this report, we break down exactly how this situation unfolded, why this location is so critical, and what it could mean for the future of global stability. If you want clear, fact-based analysis on the most important geopolitical events shaping our world, make sure to subscribe. Because what happens next in this story could affect everything, from global markets to the balance of power itself. To understand how the world arrived at this moment, you have to go back decades, long before this latest escalation, long before the current political alignments, to a time when control over oil routes first became synonymous with global power. The Strait of Hormuz has always been more than just a shipping lane. Since the mid-20th century, it has functioned as a strategic artery for the global economy. As oil-rich nations in the Persian Gulf expanded production, this narrow corridor became the primary exit point for energy exports heading toward Asia, Europe, and beyond. And with that importance came tension. The roots of today's crisis can be traced back to the late 1970s, when Iran's political transformation fundamentally reshaped its relationship with the United States. The Iranian Revolution not only altered the internal structure of the country, it redefined its role in the region. From that point forward, the Strait of Hormuz became both a lifeline and a leverage point. Over the following decades, multiple confrontations unfolded in and around these waters. During the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War spilled into the Khalij, triggering what became known as the Tanker War. Oil shipments were targeted, naval escorts were deployed, and for the first time, the global economy felt the direct impact of instability in this narrow passage. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and tensions surged again as disputes over Iran's nuclear program intensified. Sanctions were imposed. Military posturing increased. Iranian officials repeatedly warned that if pressured too far, they could disrupt shipping through Hormuz. Those warnings were not theoretical. They were strategic signals. In 2018, the situation escalated sharply when the United States withdrew from the nuclear agreement with Iran and reinstated sweeping sanctions. Oil exports from Iran were heavily restricted, and once again, the strait became a focal point of confrontation. Incidents involving tanker seizures, drone shootdowns, and naval encounters began to increase in frequency. Each event added another layer of instability. Each response hardened positions. And then came the most recent sequence of events. In the days leading up to this announcement, intelligence reports indicated unusual naval activity in the region. U.S. carrier groups were repositioned. Surveillance flights increased. At the same time, Iranian forces conducted military drills near key maritime routes, moves widely interpreted as signaling readiness. Then, almost without warning, the order was issued. Day 1. U.S. naval forces begin enforcing new restrictions on tanker movements linked to Iranian exports. Day 2. Commercial shipping companies halt or reroute vessels amid rising insurance risks. Day 3. Oil markets react sharply, with volatility spreading across global exchanges. Day 4. Iran issues a formal condemnation, warning of proportional responses. What makes this timeline particularly alarming is how quickly each stage unfolded. What might once have taken weeks or months has now occurred in a matter of days. And behind every step are key players shaping the outcome. The United States, seeking to apply maximum pressure. Iran, determined to resist and respond. Regional powers, caught between alignment and self-preservation. And global economies, now exposed to a crisis they cannot control, but will certainly feel. This is not an isolated event. It is the culmination of years of tension, miscalculation, and strategic rivalry, now compressed into a moment that could redefine the balance of power in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. The official announcement was brief. No lengthy press conference. No drawn-out diplomatic framing. Just a rapid declaration that U.S. forces had initiated enforcement operations in the Strait of Hormuz to protect international maritime security and prevent destabilizing energy transfers. Those words were deliberate. But behind that carefully crafted language was a dramatic escalation, one that unfolded in stages over just a few hours. According to early operational reports, the first visible sign came when U.S. naval vessels moved into expanded patrol formations near the main tanker lanes in the strait. Commercial vessels approaching the corridor began receiving routing instructions, while some ships believed to be carrying Iranian-linked crude were reportedly halted for inspection. Then came the market reaction. Shipping insurers immediately reassessed the risk profile of the region. Freight operators suspended departures. Oil traders began pricing in the possibility of a prolonged disruption. Within hours, financial markets responded with sharp volatility, as energy-dependent sectors braced for supply instability. From the U.S. perspective, this was a defensive measure. Officials argue that the operation is designed to prevent the movement of sanctioned oil exports and to protect what they describe as lawful navigation. The narrative from Washington frames the action as a targeted enforcement effort, not a blockade, not an act of war, but a strategic move to pressure Iran economically while maintaining regional order. But Iran tells a very different story. Tehran has described the operation as an unlawful attempt to weaponize a global trade route. Iranian officials accuse the United States of using military power to strangle economic access, arguing that this crosses the line from sanctions enforcement into open economic warfare. And that distinction matters. Because if one side sees enforcement while the other sees aggression, the risk of retaliation rises dramatically. Iranian state sources claim that military readiness levels were raised within hours of the announcement. Coastal defense units reportedly entered high alert, and naval patrol activity increased near critical maritime zones. Neither side is fully disclosing its intentions, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes the situation so dangerous. Competing reports have also created confusion about the exact scope of the operation. Some intelligence assessments suggest the U.S. is targeting only specific shipments connected to Iranian exports. Others indicate broader restrictions that could affect neutral commercial traffic moving through the same waters. That uncertainty has created a vacuum, and in geopolitics, vacuums are filled quickly. Analysts are now examining satellite data, shipping logs, and naval movement reports to determine what is actually happening on the ground. Some reports indicate that tankers are already diverting routes. Others suggest that several vessels remain stalled, waiting for clarity before entering the strait. And then there is the intelligence question. Has Iran prepared a response? Security officials believe Tehran has multiple options, ranging from diplomatic retaliation to limited maritime disruption. Some reports suggest proxy forces in the region have also been placed on alert, raising fears that retaliation may not occur in the strait itself, but elsewhere in the region. At this stage, what is confirmed is limited. U.S. naval enforcement actions are underway. Commercial shipping has been disrupted. Iran has condemned the move and signaled readiness. Beyond that, much remains uncertain. But uncertainty in a crisis like this is not stabilizing. It is destabilizing. Because every unclear move invites interpretation. Every interpretation invites reaction. And every reaction increases the chance that one miscalculation could turn a strategic pressure campaign into a direct confrontation. Right now, both sides are sending signals. The world is trying to decode them. And the next move may determine whether this remains an economic crisis or becomes a military one. To understand why this confrontation has sent shockwaves through every major capital in the world, you have to understand what is at stake beyond politics, beyond ideology, and even beyond the immediate military standoff. This is about geography, specifically, one of the most strategically concentrated waterways on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the wider Arabian Sea. At its narrowest point, it is roughly 21 miles wide, but the actual shipping lanes are even narrower, making them highly vulnerable to disruption, surveillance, and control. And yet, through this fragile corridor flows nearly one-fifth of the world's oil supply. That single fact is what transforms this from a regional dispute into a global economic threat. From a military perspective, control, or even partial disruption of Hormuz provides immediate leverage over global energy markets. It gives any dominant naval force the ability to influence not just regional actors, but also distant economies that depend on uninterrupted oil flow. For the United States, maintaining freedom of navigation through this corridor has long been a core strategic objective. Naval deployments in the region are not symbolic. They are designed to ensure that no single regional actor can shut down or monopolize access to global energy routes. For Iran, however, the strait represents something entirely different. It is one of the few geographic choke points where Tehran holds asymmetric leverage. While Iran's conventional military power is limited compared to global superpowers, its proximity to the strait gives it the ability to threaten disruption through fast attack craft, mines, missiles, and coastal surveillance systems. This creates a unique strategic imbalance. Not dominance, but denial capability. Even the threat of disruption is enough to alter global behavior. From an operational standpoint, modern naval strategy in this region is not about large fleet engagements. It is about control of perception, radar coverage, electronic warfare, and rapid response capability. Every vessel entering the Strait of Hormuz is tracked, categorized, and assessed in real time. That makes escalation extremely sensitive, because misidentification or miscommunication can escalate instantly from surveillance to engagement. Geographically, there are no viable alternative routes that can fully replace Hormuz at scale. Pipelines exist, but they are limited in capacity and cannot absorb global demand if the strait were significantly disrupted. This is why global energy markets react so violently to even rumors of instability here. And strategically, this moment reshapes the regional balance in three critical ways. First, it increases the importance of naval dominance in the Gulf, forcing external powers to maintain permanent high-readiness deployments. Second, it elevates Iran's deterrence value, even under heavy sanctions and economic pressure. Third, it exposes global dependence on a single vulnerable corridor, highlighting a structural weakness in the international energy system. In military planning terms, this is the definition of a high-risk choke point environment. Small actions produce outsized consequences. A single convoy delay can shift global pricing. A single interception can trigger diplomatic escalation. A single confrontation can spiral into broader conflict involving multiple state actors. That is why analysts consistently describe the Strait of Hormuz not as a regional waterway, but as a global pressure valve. And right now, that valve is under maximum strain. As this crisis intensifies, governments are no longer relying on public statements alone. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies, defense analysts, and energy experts are working to assess not just what is happening, but what could happen next. According to multiple intelligence community assessments, the primary concern is not a full-scale naval war, but a miscalculation that triggers one. In environments like the Strait of Hormuz, escalation rarely begins with a declared decision. It begins with interpretation, of movement, of intent, of proximity. Analysts warn that the current posture of U.S. naval enforcement operations significantly increases the risk of contact escalation, where routine monitoring or interdiction procedures could be perceived as hostile acts. One recurring assessment from Western defense institutions highlights a key vulnerability: the density of military and commercial traffic in an extremely confined space. In such conditions, even advanced identification systems can fail to prevent misclassification of vessels. Think tank experts at major geopolitical institutes describe the situation as a compressed escalation environment, where decision time is reduced to minutes, not hours. That compression forces commanders on both sides to act with incomplete information. Military analysts also point to Iran's long-standing doctrine of asymmetric maritime deterrence. Rather than attempting to match large naval forces directly, Iran has historically focused on disruption capability, fast attack craft, missile batteries along the coast, and potential mine deployment strategies. According to security researchers, even the credible threat of mining shipping lanes can increase global insurance costs and reduce commercial traffic without a single shot being fired. Energy policy experts are also closely watching the market response. They note that oil pricing is now highly sensitive not just to actual supply disruption, but to perceived risk. Futures markets are reacting within minutes of every new development, reflecting deep uncertainty about stability in the region. Some economists within international financial institutions have warned that sustained instability in Hormuz could trigger a multi-layered shock, combining energy inflation, shipping disruptions, and broader market volatility. This type of shock would not remain regional. It would propagate through global supply chains within days. Military scholars further emphasize that naval power in this region is not purely about force projection, it is about deterrence signaling. Every ship movement, escort pattern, and radio communication is interpreted as a message. One defense analyst summarized the situation bluntly: in the Strait of Hormuz, ambiguity is the greatest risk factor. Meanwhile, intelligence monitoring suggests that regional actors are actively seeking external support. Diplomatic channels between Gulf states, Western allies, and Asian energy importers have reportedly intensified as governments attempt to secure contingency supply routes and stabilize markets. China and India, both heavily dependent on Gulf energy imports, are particularly sensitive to any sustained disruption. Analysts note that even short-term instability can force rapid strategic adjustments in their energy procurement policies. Across the intelligence community, there is no consensus on the next step, but there is broad agreement on one point: the system is under extreme stress. Not because war has been declared, but because multiple actors are now operating under conditions of uncertainty, speed, and limited communication. And in that environment, history shows that escalation often happens not because it is planned, but because it becomes unavoidable. But the other side has a point. Not every analyst agrees that this situation is a direct path toward large-scale conflict or uncontrolled escalation. In fact, several diplomatic and strategic interpretations suggest a more controlled, even calculated form of pressure is at play. From this perspective, the reported blockade or maritime enforcement action is not a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but a targeted operation aimed at specific shipping networks linked to sanctioned Iranian energy exports. In other words, the objective may be financial and coercive rather than militarily escalatory. Supporters of this interpretation argue that the language of blockade itself may be politically amplified. In modern maritime enforcement, distinctions between inspection regimes, sanctions enforcement, and naval blockade are significant, and often deliberately blurred in public discourse. Diplomatic observers also point out that major powers generally avoid actions that would completely shut down Hormuz, precisely because of the global economic consequences. A total closure would harm not only Iran or the United States, but also allied economies, energy importing nations, and global markets. Instead, they suggest this could be a calibrated pressure campaign designed to force negotiation leverage rather than trigger confrontation. Some policy analysts argue that previous US-Iran confrontations have followed a pattern of escalation signaling followed by back-channel de-escalation. In this model, public shows of force are used to shape diplomatic outcomes behind the scenes, rather than to initiate direct conflict. There is also an economic argument being raised. Certain energy market experts believe the sharp price movements may be driven more by trader psychology than by actual physical supply disruption. In this view, volatility reflects fear of potential escalation rather than confirmed loss of supply capacity. Shipping analysts add another layer of nuance. While disruptions have been reported, global tanker traffic has not fully halted. Many vessels continue to transit the region under naval escort or adjusted routing protocols. This suggests partial disruption, not total shutdown. From Iran's perspective, some diplomats argue that rhetorical escalation may serve a domestic and strategic signaling purpose. Strong public statements about resistance or countermeasures are often used to maintain internal political cohesion and external deterrence credibility, without necessarily committing to immediate military action. Similarly, U.S. officials may be signaling strength to deter further escalation while still leaving room for negotiation. In this interpretation, both sides are engaged in a high-stakes signaling game rather than an irreversible march toward war. However, even those who support this more restrained view acknowledge a critical risk: misinterpretation. Because in environments like this, intent is not always clear, and perception often drives reality. A single misread radar signal, an intercepted vessel, or an overreaction to a perceived threat could still disrupt this delicate balance. So while the alternative interpretation suggests controlled escalation rather than imminent war, it does not eliminate danger. It reframes it. Instead of a straight path to conflict, it becomes a narrow corridor of calculated pressure, where stability depends entirely on restraint, communication, and timing. And history shows that those are the most fragile variables of all. Even in its earliest phase, this crisis is already producing ripple effects far beyond the Persian Gulf. The first and most immediate impact is in global energy markets. Oil prices are highly sensitive to any perceived disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, and even partial uncertainty is enough to trigger rapid price volatility. Traders are no longer reacting only to physical supply changes. They are pricing in geopolitical risk minute by minute. If instability continues, the consequences could extend into sustained energy inflation. Higher crude prices typically translate into increased transportation costs, higher manufacturing expenses, and ultimately higher consumer prices across global markets. In practical terms, this means inflation pressure could re-emerge in economies that were only recently stabilizing. Shipping and insurance industries are also under immediate strain. Maritime insurers have reportedly begun reassessing risk premiums for vessels passing through the region. Higher insurance costs often get passed directly into global trade pricing, increasing the cost of goods far beyond the Middle East. On the military front, sustained tension in the Strait of Hormuz requires continuous naval deployment. That means aircraft carriers, destroyers, surveillance systems, and allied forces must remain in high operational readiness. Such deployments are expensive, resource-intensive, and strategically draining over time. Geopolitically, the consequences extend even further. China, which depends heavily on Gulf oil imports, faces strategic vulnerability if energy flows are disrupted. Any prolonged instability forces Beijing to accelerate diversification of energy routes and reserves. India faces a similar challenge, with its growing energy demands tied closely to Gulf supply stability. For NATO-aligned economies, the concern is not only energy cost, but also broader regional security spillover. A sustained crisis in Hormuz increases pressure on Western naval commitments, potentially stretching defense resources already engaged in other global theaters. Russia, meanwhile, watches such developments through an economic lens. Higher oil prices can strengthen its export revenues, even as global instability complicates broader diplomatic relations. But the most immediate impact is felt far from strategic command centers. It is felt in everyday life. If oil prices rise significantly, gasoline prices at the pump in countries like the United States can increase within days or weeks. Transportation costs affect food distribution, consumer goods pricing, and supply chain stability. Even industries that seem disconnected from geopolitics, retail, agriculture, aviation, become exposed to the same shockwave. This is what makes the Strait of Hormuz unique. A single geographic corridor, thousands of miles away from most consumers, can influence household budgets across continents. And beyond economics, there is a psychological impact as well. Periods of geopolitical instability tend to increase uncertainty in financial markets, reduce investor confidence, and create broader global caution in trade and investment decisions. In other words, this is not just a regional security issue. It is a systemic global stress test, and every participant in the international system, from governments to corporations to individuals, feels its effects in different but connected ways. What happens next will depend on a narrow set of decisions made under extreme pressure. At the center of this unfolding situation are three critical pathways: military enforcement, diplomatic intervention, or gradual de escalation through back-channel negotiation. The first and most immediate development to watch is naval posture in the Strait of Hormuz. Any increase in escort operations, vessel inspections, or restricted transit zones will signal that enforcement is intensifying rather than stabilizing. Conversely, a reduction in patrol density or a shift toward monitored passage could indicate an effort to lower tensions. The second key factor is Iran's response strategy. So far, public statements have focused on condemnation and warnings, but the real indicator will be whether Tehran chooses symbolic retaliation, economic countermeasures, or direct maritime action. Each option carries a dramatically different escalation risk. The third factor lies in diplomatic channels. Behind the scenes communication between major powers, particularly involving Gulf states, Western allies, and energy importing nations, will determine whether pressure can be redirected into negotiations rather than confrontation. What is confirmed at this stage is that maritime operations in and around the Strait of Hormuz have been significantly disrupted. Commercial shipping has adjusted routes, insurance costs have risen, and markets have reacted sharply to perceived instability. What remains uncertain is the durability of this disruption, and whether it represents a short-term pressure campaign or the opening phase of a longer strategic confrontation. Two scenarios now dominate expert discussion. In the first scenario, diplomatic off-ramps succeed. Back-channel negotiations lead to a recalibration of enforcement measures, allowing shipping flows to stabilize. Markets recover partially, and the situation becomes another episode in a long pattern of managed tension between global powers. In the second scenario, miscalculation or retaliation triggers a broader escalation. A single maritime incident could expand enforcement actions, provoke countermeasures, and draw in additional regional actors. In that case, energy markets would face prolonged disruption, and global security institutions would come under severe strain. Neither outcome is guaranteed, and that uncertainty is what defines this moment. Because in geopolitics, the most dangerous phase is not always the moment of conflict itself. It is the period where every actor believes they are still in control, even as the system becomes increasingly unstable. The Strait of Hormuz has reached that threshold before. But rarely has the global system been as interconnected, as dependent, and as sensitive to disruption as it is today. And that is why the world is watching so closely. Not because war is inevitable, but because the margin for error has rarely been so thin. We will continue tracking developments as this situation evolves in real time. For continued updates and analysis on global geopolitical crises, subscribe to stay informed.